like audiences all over the world, they like what are called high concept films, which often are Hollywood films. Avatar, Titanic are the most prominent examples, but also the franchise or tentpole films like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean. They're all very successful. All Batman films, all very successful all over the world. So that's kind of a given. That's one thing. But the tastes are somewhat different in the sense that, especially now in 2013, 2012 was a very good year for Hollywood films in China. 2013 has not been a good year so far, but Chinese films, especially romantic comedies and comedies in general, have done quite well recently in China. But some of them are based on, for example, Sleepless in Seattle has been kind of loosely remade into a film called Finding Mr. Right, which has done very well recently. Chinese tastes then are looking more and more to develop their own kind of personality, people on the screen that they can relate to. American romantic comedies wouldn't do very well in China. They're very much trying to localize their films. So they're not necessarily that different, but they are very local. Whereas Hollywood makes films for the entire world, China's really making films just for China. They'd like to make films for the entire world, but they have succeeded very poorly, except for a few examples in the past. If I can, I'd like to go back beyond the last decade because the real changes came earlier. Back in the 80s, for example, before what happened in Tiananmen student demonstrations in 1989, there was very little information coming in about Western culture into China until, let's say, the late 80s when Freud, Nietzsche, Sartre were very popular on university campuses. But in the mid-80s, I was traveling around China extensively, talking to university students. And because they were suspicious of their own government, knowing their own government was lying about what they were doing, they assumed that everything the Voice of America or the BBC said was accurate. And I told them that you should be suspicious of all governments and all media. After the government tried to restore legitimacy after 1989, by the early 90s, particularly beginning in 1992, more information, American culture began coming in. The first American theatrical film that came in was The Fugitive in October 1994. And so they began to find out more about the United States. And it was ironic in a sense, the more they learned about Western culture, and particularly the United States, the more nationalistic they became. Because they found that all governments lie and all governments do bad things as well as good things. So the real changes came earlier. I would say, give one example. Elizabeth Rosenthal was a reporter for the New York Times, and she once interviewed someone who had just been laid off from her job at a glossy fashion magazine. And she said, "I'm suing this company." And Elizabeth Rosenthal asked her, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Well, I've seen all these Hollywood films, and I've realized that at some point in your life you're expected to sue somebody, and this is a good time to do it." So that was in the relatively early stages in the 90s when they didn't know that much, but they learned a lot about America, not just from films, but from TV shows. Dynasty, for example, was a show very popular on Chinese TV. Hotel was another one. These shows about very rich people, where the government was presumably showing this because they wanted to show the different classes in the U.S., how the rich people were dominating everything. But in fact, it had the opposite message. Wow, this is a really abundant culture. It would be a great place to go to. So the messages the government was sending were not being received the same way by the population. Now, of course, since then, you've had hundreds of thousands of students coming to the United States and the West more generally, studying abroad, and then going back to China. So there's a lot more sophistication. You now have any American situation comedy or drama, Big Bang Theory, take one example, Friends, they're all widely available in pirated copies or through downloading in China. So they've learned a lot more about American culture. And if you look at the surveys on American culture in China, you find that most people identify with it. That hasn't changed that much in the last 10 years. I would say the biggest change is probably, at least in the film industry particularly, and also in TV as well, is China's producing their own programs on TV, which are based on American shows or British shows or Australian shows. American Idol became Supergirl. There was a British show which ended up being If You Are the One. Very popular shows, dating shows, for example, or shows like American Idol where you have new talent being discovered. In films, they're doing these romantic comedies, which have been based often on films from overseas. So that's probably the biggest change, is they're producing their local talent now. It used to be, when I first started writing about film in China, there were really very few stars. Jackie Chan certainly, but he's from Hong Kong. Very few homegrown stars that people can identify with. Now, Chinese stars are becoming very well known. So, for example, this may get to another question. It's not directly related to what you're asking now, but it's an important development. Hollywood is doing a lot of co-productions with China and also partnering in a lot of ways. So, for example, a movie like Iron Man 3, which is going to be coming out, probably not as a co-production, although they've talked about it, will have a separate version for China with the Chinese actress Fan Bingbing, who's very well known in China, not known abroad at all. So they have a separate version for the China market. Looper was another film that had a separate version for the China market. And I think this is going to be more and more common, that you want a kind of Chinese component in these films, which will just show. China market is so big now that the Hollywood studios can justify that kind of partnership. One of the problems in China, as I'm sure you know, is censorship. And the kinds of films that are made about Chinese society really are, let's say, romantic comedies. You can't do quote-unquote serious films about contemporary China. If you look at China's leading film director in terms of box office, it's probably Feng Xiaogang. And he's done films on the Tangshan and Sichuan earthquakes called Aftershock. He's done a film called 1942 about the famine in Henan province in 1942. He would love to make films about the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, or as he says, I can make films about natural disasters. I cannot make films about man-made disasters or mistakes that the party makes. And that's the biggest obstacle to really mirroring what's going on in Chinese society. So they have to basically follow those guidelines, and therefore you make relatively innocuous films. You can't do any kind of cutting-edge kinds of things or any critical things. If you look at the censorship regulations, there are a whole variety of things, and the censorship board includes police, public security, Women's Federation, Youth League, so many groups involved, and they can veto whatever they want. So it's very hard to make a film which really reflects the vision, let's say, that the director might want to put in there. It's getting better, but I think it's very difficult to mirror what's going on in Chinese society, because you can't show films where the police are doing bad things, even though we know that they do bad things. Police everywhere do good things and bad things. You can't show films that make China somehow appear in a bad light. And a lot of these Hollywood studios in making films in China, especially the co-productions, will sometimes have people on the set to vet things. Even Hollywood, again, the market is so big now in China that Hollywood studios making films where China plays a role will change the film. This may be a little bit tangential to the question you're asking, but the most celebrated recent example is Red Dawn, a remake of a 1984 film where the Soviet Union was invading a town in Colorado, and the high school kids basically fight them off. They had a remake of that film where, again, instead of the Russians, it was the Chinese, when somebody pointed out, hey, if you want the China market, that's not going to work. So they spend millions of dollars basically digitizing and changing the bad guys from Chinese to North Koreans. So that's an extreme example, but that kind of stuff happens. And you see that even in films like Looper. You look at a film like 2012, which was very successful in China, but it's very clear it was made with the China market in mind, because China saves the world. They escape from North America with all these earthquakes and terrible things. They land in China. The People's Liberation Army says, welcome to China. The Chinese build these arcs to leave the planet. And one of the characters says, wow, I never thought it could be done. Leave it to the Chinese. They're the only ones who could solve this problem. And the audience cheers in China. So it's that kind of thing, basically. Yeah, the China market is going to surpass North America, actually, probably in the middle, maybe the next 5 years or so, that the market for films in China will be bigger than in the United States. But in terms of mirroring Chinese society, real restrictions there. We start with the quota system. When China first started accepting theatrical, they used to buy American films on a flat fee basis, maybe $50,000. They can show it as often as they like. But the box office in China was really declining precipitously. So as one solution, because films were really weak, so in terms of story, content, and so on. So they invited Hollywood in 1994, Warner Brothers, The Fugitive, and 10 revenue sharing, what they call revenue sharing films, where Hollywood studios got no more than 13% of the box office. But 10 films were allowed each year, foreign films. That included Hong Kong films with Jackie Chan and so on. After 2003, the Hong Kong films were no longer subject to the quota system, but Hollywood films still were. After they entered the World Trade Organization, the quota went up from 10 to 20. As of Xi Jinping's visit to the U.S. last year, it went from 20 to 34, but 14 of those films have to be 3D or IMAX films. So one is the quota system. One of the restrictions is the quota system. And the way you get around the quota system, in part, is to do co-productions. And co-productions, actually now also, it's gone from about 13% to 25% of the box office. It's increased just very recently. Co-productions, you're not subject to the quota system. You can get as much as 40% of the box office. The problem with co-productions is that you have to have something like a third of the actors and stars being Chinese. You have to have a crew being Chinese. The content has to be about China, a substantial part of it. And therefore, Hollywood studios are faced with the decision as to whether to make films for the China market or for the international market. So Iron Man 3, for example, has made the decision, it looks like. It's probably opening April 26th or so in China, before it opens in the US in May. They've made the decision to make it for the international market, the global marketplace, and do a separate version for China. Every Hollywood studio has to weigh these factors. The co-productions, if you look at Chinese films abroad, over the last 3 years, 2010, 2011, 2012, they've gone down by about 2/3 in terms of box office revenue because co-productions have gone down. And these co-productions, the Chinese have an expression, 同床异梦, same bed, different dreams. What Hollywood wants from co-productions and what China wants from co-productions, two very different things. Hollywood wants access to the China market. China wants access to the international market and also to develop its soft power. And therefore, they want co-productions to reflect Chinese culture and to build Chinese stars for the international market. That's not going to happen. So the co-productions that have been most successful, let's say in 2009 and 2010, for example, when China did relatively well compared to now on the world market, were not really co-productions, only in name. 2009, Mummy 3 made about 42% of all Chinese revenue internationally, Mummy 3. In the following years is Karate Kid, 2010, made about almost 68% of all Chinese revenue overseas for Chinese films was made by that one film, Karate Kid, which is Will Smith's son and Jackie Chan. It's not really a Chinese film. It's really a Hollywood film, as is Mummy 3. So China's gotten much tougher on approving co-productions, which is why in the last year there's been very little in terms of any success for Chinese films overseas. Chinese films have done extremely well this year, 2013, on the local market in China, making up 80% or more of the market. Hollywood films are way down, but none of these films will travel overseas at all. So China's made a very smart decision. Well, some of the companies that have done well in China, Village Roadshow, an Australian company with an American head, Ellen Eliassoff, has done extremely well in producing the two biggest hits so far this year, I would say, Journey to the West, the Stephen Chow film, and Say Yes, a romantic comedy. They've done very well, and that's based on a old Japanese TV show, a TV series. They've done very well by concentrating just on the local market. You can't please two masters. You can either succeed in China or you can succeed overseas. It's very hard to do both, unless you're a franchise film like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter or something like that. And so the market in China is really changing and becoming much more localized. This is something that the Chinese government is really promoting. They're spending up to $10 billion a year on promoting their soft power overseas. It's ironic, and the United States is the most successful country in terms of soft power generation, whether it's Apple Computers or Starbucks or Microsoft or McDonald's. U.S. government couldn't care less about promoting its soft power. China's spending all this money and not succeeding very well. So showing their films overseas, and I've spent endless hours talking to Chinese media and Chinese officials sometimes trying to explain why they can't succeed, and they don't want to hear that. They say, but we're trying so hard, we're spending so much money. I say, yeah, but you have no knowledge of international film markets. Why does Hollywood succeed in almost every market by taking up such a large share of the market? Because they make films like Avatar, which can be, we call high concept films, which can be interpreted in the United States as about environment. It can be interpreted in China about property rights. Everybody can buy into this kind of film. These are universal stories. Chinese films did well in the United States for a while with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Hero. They did, but after 2006, Jet Li's Fearless was the last one that did well. It was all martial arts films all the time, and so if you look at some of the reviews of the more recent ones, they're basically saying, you know, doesn't China have anything else to tell us? Any other stories? We've seen this many times. But those are the only films that travel well traditionally because they're action films and the dialogue is really not that important. I always try to tell them, look, maybe 1% of the market in North America are subtitled films. If it's not in English, it's not going to succeed. Also, when they've attempted to try and succeed, when Christian Bale was hired to do Flowers of War, or Tim Robbins and Adrian Brody for back to 1942, these are films about the Second World War, either about famine, which is a real downer, or when 3 million people die, or it's about the Japanese invasion of China and the Nanjing massacre and the rape of all these women in Nanjing. Who's going to want to go see that film? It looks, for people in the West, particularly in the United States who don't know Chinese history, as if it's a propaganda film. If you're going to make a film that's going to succeed outside China, it has to be in English, and they're beginning to get that message. And if you're going to use big stars, it has to be a story that people are interested in, which don't seem to promote Chinese historical values or Chinese views of history. But they're really committed to trying to succeed on the international market. At this point, I see no prospect. And I always say to them, the answer is make films. If you look at every film market in the world, in most cases, whether it's Russia or Brazil or Taiwan, it's dominated by Hollywood. There are only a few exceptions. In the United States, for example, this is not an exception. United States, 91% of the films box office revenue are American films. In India, it's about 92%, 92.5%. The only countries that do well in having at least 50% of their box office, I would say, would be the Asian countries, China, Japan, and Korea. And China manipulates the box office in a number of ways to make sure that Hollywood never gets more than 49%. Even though they're actually getting more, there are ways to manipulate the box office. If there were time, I could tell you how they do that. But one of the obvious ways is as many blackout dates as possible during the busiest seasons of the year, like December, Spring Festival, you know, Chinese New Year, holiday periods. So they try and make it difficult for Hollywood films to succeed. But there are very few markets where local films succeed or dominate. US, India are really the only two. So you have to make films for the local market, Chinese language films, and don't worry about the overseas market, at least at this point in history.